Hello and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Please sign up at my Patreon to get episodes earlier, bonuses, to have a say on future content, and to interact with me and other Warbirders directly. But mainly you'll have the satisfaction of helping keep this podcast going. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or even just drop me a review. Thank you for your support. Now on to the show. Hello Warbirders. So when I realized that my Lancaster episodes were no longer available, I was devastated. This warbird is my logo. The Lank is literally my favorite. Not one of my faves, my fave. In part 1 of this series, I talk about my lifelong love affair with the Lank. But the advantage is now that it does give me a chance to fix a few things in this episode and release it fresh. Remember, you can always check out images on the World of Warbirds Patreon page in order to see the many aircraft described today. I'll be mentioning a lot of Lancaster spawned types, so you'd be well advised to check out the link to Patreon in the show notes. It's free to join. Speaking of Patreon, thank you to Darb, Kurt Anderson, Jason, Mike V, and Spopey for becoming supporting members. It's really appreciated, and if you guys would like a shout out with something other than a strange username, please let me know. Okay, so let's dive in. If the Avro Lancaster had a motto, perhaps it would be, if at first you don't succeed, try again, and add 2 more engines. Or perhaps to be more accurate, if life hands you a lemon aircraft, try adding Merlins. I probably use the word iconic too much in my show, because then it leaves me without a word to use here. So let's take a look at the origins of this super iconic British aircraft. Let's take it way back to the beginning. Elliot Verdon Roe was born in 1877 in Lancashire. He was quite a character, and a traveler and an adventurer as a young man. He left home at the age of 14 to go to Canada to learn a trade as a surveyor. He got all the way to British Columbia when the collapse of the silver market meant that there was no more demand for surveyors at that time. He did odd jobs for a while and then returned to England, working on a railway and then trying to join the Royal Navy to study marine engineering at King's College London. But his entrance exams weren't good enough, and so he was rejected. So he started working at the dockyards and eventually signed aboard the ship SS Jebba of the British and South African Royal Mail Company on the West African run. Supposedly, it was at sea, observing the soaring albatrosses, where Verdon Roe developed his interest in aviation. Returning from sea in 1906, he began his career in this field by applying for the job of secretary of the Royal Aero Club. There were candidates who were more qualified than Verdon Roe, but he must have really wowed them in the interview because he got the job mainly due to his enthusiasm. Incidentally, the man who hired him was Charles Rolls, who was the first half of Rolls-Royce. Verdon Roe started off as a draftsman and then started designing and building his own models. A draftsman, for those who don't know, was the guy who drew blueprints that the workmen on the factory floor would use to build the part pictured. It was my dad's career, but is now mainly done by computer-aided design. Only 4 years later, on the 1st of January, 1910, Elliot Verdon Roe and his brother Humphrey Verdon Roe formed their own business, the A.V. Roe Aircraft Company, which was later renamed Avro. The company's most popular early model was the 504 biplane, which was used during the First World War and then used as a trainer by the RAF after the war. They built over 8,000 of them. In 1928, he sold his share of Avro and bought the S.E. Saunders Company forming Saunders Row. In the 1930s, he actually became a supporter of Oswald Mosley and a member of the British Union of Fascists. Yes, Britain did have a fascist party, complete with black shirt thugs and a Nazi-style flag with a lightning bolt instead of a swastika. Talk about backing the wrong horse. But both of Row's sons joined the RAF during the Second World War, and both were lost in action. Notably, his son Leighton was shot down while flying a Lancaster over Duisburg. In 1936, the British Air Ministry put out Specification P-1336 for a capable medium bomber for worldwide use. This specification requested an aircraft with an all-metal construction and a mid-mounted cantilever monoplane wing. I've used the term cantilever before, but I don't think I've ever explained it. It's not a term that really needs to be used much anymore in aviation because almost all modern aircraft are built this way. Just as all-metal construction doesn't really need to be mentioned either. A cantilever wing is a type of aircraft wing that is self-supporting and requires no external bracing such as struts or wires. Instead, all the structural strength comes from within the wing itself, typically through internal components like spars, ribs, and a load-bearing skin. This design offers significant aerodynamic advantages by eliminating the drag caused by the external supports, resulting in smoother airflow and greater efficiency. Cantilever wings became increasingly popular in the 1920s and 1930s, but at the time of this Air Ministry specification, it still needed to be said. The hope was to use the Rolls-Royce Vulture engine, which was in development at the time. Initially, at least, the Vulture engine looked very promising. Its design was an X-24 configuration, which basically took two Rolls-Royce Peregrine-derived V12 blocks and arranged them in an X shape, all turning a common crankshaft. This super engine was supposed to produce 1,750 horsepower, which would mean that two engines would be sufficient to power the new big bomber. Avro designed and submitted an aircraft that was called the Manchester. With the dark clouds of a new world war looming, the Avro Manchester was designed to be built fast and repaired easily. If you've never seen one, but you have seen a Lancaster, just think of the Lancaster with two engines missing and corresponding slightly shorter wings. The fuselage was all metal with a flush riveted skin of aluminum alloy to reduce drag. The wings had two spars, and fuel was contained in several self-sealing fuel tanks all within the wings. This was intended to allow the biggest bomb bay possible in the fuselage. The tail was a twin fin and rudder configuration, which allowed for great vision for the dorsal gunner. The Air Ministry thought that it had a winner with the Manchester, and in February 1937 it was selected as the primary candidate for production, and ordered right off the drawing board with Handley Page's aircraft, to be named the Halifax, and the Short Stirling were chosen as the second string. In August 1940, the Manchesters began being delivered to the RAF, and they became fully operational by November. However, by spring 1941, the RAF was having major problems with their Manchesters. It turns out the Vulture was not producing the promised amount of horsepower, which meant that the heavy airplane was always underpowered, even when both engines were running. And that leads us to the next problem with the Vulture. The X-type configuration had difficulties with lubrication and dissipating heat. Worst of all, the connecting rods were too weak, which led to failures. Here's a quote from a crew member to be found in Before the Lancs, Early Days, Personal Stories, published by the Bomber Command Association. Open quotes. I have seen an aircraft doing a run-up on the ground and have two pistons come right out the sides of the engine. The original bearings were made without any silver as an economy measure, so they weren't hard enough. The bearings would collapse, the connecting rod and the piston would fling out through the sides of the engine, and bang! Your engine just destroyed itself. Close quotes. A bit disconcerting, to say the least. Although about 200 Manchesters were built, and they did fly in combat, the lack of power and engine reliability meant that the type was doomed. They were withdrawn from operations in mid-1942. This is where the story starts to get really interesting. In 1940, even as the first production Manchesters were being delivered to the RAF, Avro's chief design engineer, Roy Chadwick, began working on improving the Manchester design. He decided to try changing out the Manchester's two troublesome Vulture engines and swapping in 4 less powerful, but much more reliable, Rolls-Royce Merlin engines installed on a larger wing. This prototype, serial number BT308, was initially designated as the Manchester 3. It was later renamed the Lancaster. On the 9th of January 1941, test pilot H.A. Sam Brown took the prototype up for its maiden flight at RAF Ringway, Cheshire. The airplane was a hit from the start, and almost immediately, Manchester fuselages were being diverted from their production line to be switched to the new Lancaster model. The initial contract was for 1,070 Lancasters. However, soon enough, the RAF was demanding just as many of the type that could possibly be produced. Other companies were soon brought in to build Lancasters. Avro built the most at over 5,000. However, Armstrong Whitworth, Austin Motors, Metropolitan Vickers, and Vickers Armstrong also built them. In all, over 7,300 Lancasters were built during the war. In August 1942, a Lancaster Mark I, serial number R5727, built by Avro Aircraft, took off and flew west across the Atlantic in order to be a pattern aircraft for Lancaster production at the Victory Aircraft Company in Canada. It seemed an almost impossible task. The new company was to somehow figure out how to build and put together the 50,000 major separate components of the Lancaster and do it with newly hired and mainly unskilled workers. Amazingly enough, 16 months after starting, the first Canadian Lancaster, serial number KB700, named the Ruhr Express, was rolled out and flown to Europe to participate in the battle. The workforce building Lancasters at the Malton, Ontario factory had ballooned from 3,000 to almost 10,000, and at its peak, they were building a new bomber every day. In the end, building over 400. The Canadian Lancasters had US-built Packard Merlin engines, and there were several differences in instrumentation and turrets that were available in North America. Overall, the Lancaster was an exceptional aircraft, being described as near perfect for its type and size. It was fast for its massive size and very smooth in flight. Pilots described it as handling like a fighter and a fairly easy airplane to fly. Lancasters were able to be looped and barrel rolled, and sometimes they were even able to out-jinx their Luftwaffe attackers using something called a corkscrew maneuver, which was a wild defensive tactic when you consider that it was a heavy 4-engine bomber doing it. When a fighter was spotted approaching, usually from the rear gunner would call out a direction such as "Corkscrew, port, go!" prompting the pilot to begin the sequence. The maneuver started with a sharp bank to the indicated side, combined with a steep diving turn to rapidly lose altitude and throw off the attacker's aim. Once the dive was complete, the pilot would roll the aircraft level and begin a climbing turn in the opposite direction, effectively tracing a spiral or corkscrew shape through the sky. This sudden and aggressive change in speed, altitude, and direction made it difficult for enemy gunners or radar to track the bomber. The Lancasters were very strongly built and could take a lot of punishment and still come home. even able to limp home back to base on 2 engines. There were some complaints, one being that the wing spar, which went right through the fuselage, was a major obstacle to moving about the aircraft. Another problem that the escape hatches were too small, making the Lanc much harder to escape from if it came time to bail out. The depressingly low statistic was that only 15% of downed Lancaster aircrew were able to bail out. As a comparison, in the Lancaster's sister RAF bomber, the Handley Page Halifax, 25% of downed crew were able to get out successfully, while in American bombers, 50% of their crews were able to get out, although most of these escapes were done in daylight when it was easier to find the hatch to get out. The standard crew of a Lancaster was 7. Let's do a bit of a walkthrough. In the cockpit, the pilot and flight engineer had excellent all-round vision under the expansive glass canopy. The flight engineer's position was equipped with instruments to manage the engines and fuel system. The bomb aimer station, which could be accessed by lifting the flight engineer's seat and going through a passageway beside the instrument panel, was inside the aircraft's nose. The forward turret and the optical bomb sight was housed in this compartment. During the bomb run, the bomb aimer lay prone on the floor looking through the bomb sight. The rest of the time, he manned the Fraser-Nash FN-5 nose turret, which mounted 2 .303 caliber machine guns with 1,000 rounds per gun. Behind the pilot and flight engineer sat the navigator at a desk facing port, or left, behind a curtain so that he could use a light to see his maps and charts and do his calculations, and see the instrument panel in front of him showing airspeed and altitude. To the left of the navigator was a stack of radio equipment, and the wireless operator sat behind that, facing forward, just in front of the main spar. He had a window to his left, and the astrodome was above him, which was used for visually sighting when the navigator needed to do a star shot for celestial navigation. The bombs were housed on bomb racks inside a massive internal bomb bay. Originally designed this big in order to be able to carry 2 naval torpedoes, the bomb bay covered nearly 2/3 of the underside of the fuselage. Behind was the mid-upper gunner who sat on a canvas sling beneath his turret. He also had 1,000 rounds per gun for his 2 .303 caliber machine guns. Way in the rear was the tail-end Charlie rear gunner with 4 .303 machine guns. Due to the Luftwaffe's rear approach technique, this gunner position proved to be the most important in the whole aircraft, and several modifications were made over the course of the war to try to make it more effective. Some gunners removed portions or the entire Perspex panel in order to have a better view to look for night fighters. The Rose turret, which mounted 250 caliber machine guns for greater punch, was installed on a select few Lancasters, and some late war aircraft had these guns guided by radar. But one of the biggest advantages of the Lancaster was its massive 33-foot long bomb bay, which seemed to be able to carry anything that could be dreamed up. Of course, the Lancaster could haul 500 and 1,000-pound general-purpose high-explosive bombs, but it could also carry the 4,000-pound high-capacity bomb, which was known as a cookie, and with modifications, it could carry the 8,000-pound or 12,000-pound cookies. It could also carry the small bomb container, or SBC, which held between 24 to 236 4 to 30-pound incendiary and explosive bomblets. It could also carry anti-shipping mines and anti-submarine depth charges too. If all of that wasn't enough, the Lancaster was the delivery aircraft of choice for several very special bombs, such as the Wallace or Upkeep bouncing bomb, the Tallboy, and the Grand Slam. More about those later. Number 44 Squadron, which was based at RAF Waddington, Lincolnshire, became the first RAF squadron to convert to the Lancaster in early 1942. And the first actual mission of the aircraft was on the 2nd of March 1942 when Lancasters from this squadron dropped naval mines in the vicinity of Heligoland Bight. 8 days later, on the 10th of March 1942, they were on their first actual bombing mission, which was an attack on the German city of Essen. During the course of the British night bombing offensive, increasing numbers of Lancasters became available. But due to their superior performance, the RAF and Bomber Harris really would have preferred to get even more. He went so far as to call it Bomber Command's Shining Sword. There was even much debate about whether to convert the factories building Handley Page Halifaxes over to Lancasters. There were clear advantages to the Lanc over the Halifax. Unlike the almost fighter-like flight performance of the Lancaster, the Halifax had an annoying rudder problem that, even with modifications, never really went away. If a Halifax pilot threw his machine into a dramatic maneuver to try to escape from flak or night fighters, they were likely to unbalance, lock on, and eventually produce a spiral dive, from which it was difficult to recover. Overall, Lancasters were slightly faster, had a higher ceiling than the Halifax, which was important in avoiding attack. The Lancaster's exhaust flames were less visible at night, and Bomber Harris complained that he had to use his Lancs as a safety blanket to protect the more vulnerable Halifaxes. Lastly, the whole point of the offensive was to deliver the most weight of bombs to the enemy, and in this purely numerical, statistical analysis, the Lancaster was the clear winner. The Halifax's bomb bay was smaller and divided into sections, meaning that it was incapable of carrying the big 4,000-pound cookie bombs or any of the exotic bigger weapons of the RAF. On average, over its operational life, the Lancaster would deliver 150 tons of bombs on German targets, while a Halifax would only deliver 100. It also took less labor to build a Lancaster. It took 330 man-hours to build a Lancaster, while it took 420 man-hours to build a Halifax. So why didn't Britain stop building Halifaxes and convert over to all Lancaster production? The main problem was that of conversion. If the British aircraft industry was to start converting its production to Lancasters, then there would be an overall drop in bomber production during that time while the factories rejigged. For British leadership, all the way up to Churchill, this was unacceptable. Also, there was some worry that there wouldn't have been sufficient Merlin engines to equip any more Lancasters. The Halifaxes used an alternate engine, which was the Bristol Hercules. In fact, the worry of Merlin engine supply was so serious that the Lancaster B2 version was developed to use this alternate engine. So if you see a picture of a Lancaster with radial engines, you're seeing one of the 300 built using the Bristol Hercules. There are some warbirds that during the course of the war are asked to do more and seem to accept modification after modification and just keep on doing good work. The Lancaster was one of them. Some variants had bulging bomb doors to carry the giant 12,000-pound tallboy bombs. The doors were removed completely to carry the enormous 22,000-pound Grand Slam bomb. Speaking of special bombs, 23 Lancasters were built to carry the bouncing bombs, codenamed Upkeep, for the now famous dam-busting raids. For this very unique mission, the bomb bay doors were removed and special mounts were inserted to carry the bomb. A hydraulic motor, which had formerly been used for the mid-upper turret, was fitted to spin the bomb. What about the mid-upper turret? Well, it had been removed to save weight. Angled lamps were fitted in the bomb bay and nose for the simple, yet very effective, height measurement system which allowed for the accurate measurement of low flying altitude at night. The Lancaster was even considered to carry the atomic bomb to Japan before being rejected in favor of the B-29. For extra deets on all of these, please check out my British Super Bombs episode. Although, as an amateur historian, it is beyond my resources to confirm this for certain, it is estimated that the Lancaster bombers of RAF Bomber Command conducted raids against Germany on approximately 1,000 nights during World War II. The aircraft entered operational service in March 1942 and continued flying combat missions until the end of the war in May 1945. While the total span covers just over 3 years, not every night saw action due to factors like weather, moonlight, and operational planning. On average, Bomber Command launched raids 3 to 4 nights per week, with more frequent operations during key phases of the strategic bombing campaign. Taking these variables into account, historians estimate that Lancasters participated in bombing raids on roughly 900 to 1,050 nights during the war, making them one of the most heavily used and crucial aircraft of the entire conflict. Now, to see exactly what they were trying to accomplish with all this, have a listen to my episode called Big Bombers, the ideas behind strategic bombing. On the morning of the 29th of April 1945, the crew of a Lancaster named Bad Penny prepared their aircraft for a test mission of a whole new operation. This bomber, with a crew of 7, 5 of which were from Ontario, Canada, including pilot Robert Upcott of Windsor, Ontario, were so eager to fly the operation that they took off in bad weather. Unusual for these crew, that had been trained to fly very high, the profile of this mission was to fly very low, down to perhaps just 50 feet over the German guns, in order to drop their loads. Was it some kind of wonder weapon like upkeep? No. It was packages of tinned and dried food and chocolate being delivered to the starving masses in the Netherlands. Even though German forces had not formally agreed to the ceasefire on the first day, Bad Penny and another RAF Lancaster succeeded in dropping her life-saving cargo and returning to their airfield. I guess Bad Penny was appropriately named. As the old expression goes, a bad penny always turns up. These were the first flights of Operation Manna, which was named after the food which was miraculously provided to the Israelites in the book of Exodus. The American version of the operation was called the less biblical name of Operation Chowhound. It touches me now to write that sometimes people spelled out thank you on the ground in tulips. 145 Manna sorties were made by mosquitoes, but 3,156 were performed by Lancaster bombers. Also in the life-saving theme, some Lancasters were modified for air-sea rescue with an air-droppable lifeboat carried in an adapted bomb bay. Observation windows were also added to the fuselage. There was a modification for photographic reconnaissance with all the armament and turrets removed and a camera carried in the bomb bay. We've already mentioned the Lancaster 10, which was the Canadian-built version with Packard-built Merlin engines and the use of Canadian and US-made instruments and electrics. Some of them had a Martin 250CE turret installed instead of the Nash and Thompson version. The Martin turret was the same kind that was installed in the U.S. Martin B-26 Marauder, the consolidated B-24 Liberator, and Douglas A-20 Havoc. Tiger Force was a planned British Commonwealth long-range strategic bombing force intended for operations against Japan in the final stages of World War II. At its core were Avro Lancaster bombers, many of which were specifically modified for the extended distances and tropical conditions of the Pacific Theater. These Lancasters were equipped with additional fuel tanks for increased range, adapted for hot and humid climates, and often painted in a distinctive white over black camouflage scheme to reflect heat and reduce visibility over the sea. The force was to include squadrons from the RAF, RCAF, RAAF, and RNZAF, with deployment bases initially considered in India or Ceylon, later shifting to Okinawa to coordinate more closely with American forces. By mid-1945, training and preparations were well underway, but the sudden end of the war following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki meant that Tiger Force was never used in combat. Although the force never carried out a mission, it remains a fascinating what-if in the history of the Lancaster bomber, marking a significant effort to shift British air power from Europe to the Pacific. You know that a warbird is really special when the original design spawns even more types of warbirds. The Lancaster is extra special as its basic design ended up spawning a veritable flock of other war and post-war warbirds. In 1945, the Lancaster design was modified to such an extent that the new aircraft was named the Avro Lincoln, although the type doesn't look that much different. The wings were lengthened and new two-stage supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlin 85 engines were fitted. The fuselage was enlarged so that it could carry increased fuel and bombs, including the Grand Slam. With these modifications, it could also be able to fly higher and farther than the original Lancaster, with a maximum altitude of 35,000 feet and a maximum range of 4,450 miles. A few more than 600 Lincolns were built. And a note on the name. No, it was not named after the U.S. President Abraham Lincoln. It was actually named after the city of Lincoln in Lincolnshire, England. This followed the RAF's tradition of naming their heavy bombers after British cities. A further spawning was the Avro Shackleton, which was the long-range maritime patrol version of the Lincoln. This type was very fittingly named for British polar explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, reflecting long-range endurance over the ocean. I love the look of the Shackleton. Rolls-Royce Griffin engines with 13-foot diameter, that's 4 meter, contra-rotating propellers replaced the Merlins, and many changes were made for anti-submarine warfare operations, including adding special cameras and radars, equipment to drop sonobuoys, and a diesel fumes detection system to sniff for subs recharging their batteries. It could carry a combination of up to 9 bombs, 3 homing torpedoes, or depth charges, and had 2 20mm cannon in a Bristol dorsal turret. 185 were built, and the last one retired in 1991. The Lancastrian was a passenger and mail version of the Lancaster. The early ones were conversions, however later versions were built as pure passenger planes. Even though the type was not well suited for passengers, being fairly cramped in the fuselage, they continued in service until 1960. The Avro York was the transport version of the Lancaster. Although 258 of them were built, production was slow at the start, as priority for materials and production was all devoted to the bombers. One of the prototypes, series number LV633 and known as Ascalon, was the personal transport and flying conference room for Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Avro Yorks were also employed after the war during the Berlin airlift. Lastly, the Lancaster airframe was so versatile that it was used as a test bed for many new engines, including the Metropolitan Vickers F2 turbojet, the Armstrong Siddeley Mamba, various Rolls-Royce Dart turboprops, the Avro Canada Orenda, and Swedish Stahl Dovern turbojets. We are lucky enough to have many surviving examples of the Lancaster. Some are just on display. At least one, called Just Jane, is able to taxi around, giving rides to the public, and 2 are airworthy. One, PA-474, was built in 1945 and arrived on the scene too late for service. She is now part of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight in the UK. In part 1 of this series, which is my love letter to the Lancaster, then you've heard me refer to Vera, the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's Lancaster. The squadron and aircraft painted on her flanks are VRA, hence the name Vera. It's also perhaps a nod to Vera Lynn, the British singer and entertainer whose musical recordings and performances such as We'll Meet Again and White Cliffs of Dover were so popular during World War II. As I have actually seen this aircraft in action multiple times, and her picture is the front page of the World of Warbirds podcast, I will be profiling her. But as she actually contains parts of at least 2 aircraft, I'll be talking about those 2. We'll start with Lancaster 10, serial number FM213, which was built at Victory Aircraft in Malton in July 1945 and was taken on strength by the RCAF on August 21. Built too late to participate in the war, she was immediately placed in storage at the RCAF base in Trenton, Ontario. 5 years passed until she was called upon to actually serve her country. In 1950, with the Cold War heating up, it was decided that Canada needed more aircraft to patrol its expansive shorelines. And so the decision was made to convert about 70 Lancasters into maritime patrol and reconnaissance aircraft. In January 1952, MF-213's conversion to 10MR, or Maritime Reconnaissance Aircraft, was complete. A radar operator station had been added in the rear center section, as had a sonobuoy operator station in the rear section. Several cameras and observation windows had been installed, and only the nose and tail gun turrets retained. A 400-gallon fuel tank for long-range patrol duties had been added in the bomb bay. She was assigned to number 405 MR Squadron in Greenwood, Nova Scotia. On January 24th, 1952, while on approach back to RCAF Trenton, she stalled and ground looped. Her starboard landing gear collapsed as she hit the runway, and a post-crash inspection revealed that her center section was badly damaged and needed to be replaced. The problem was that by 1952, the supply of spare parts for Lancasters had dried up, and there didn't seem to be any center sections available. It seemed that FM213 was about to be written off and scrapped. However, Bob Found, one of the men who had been responsible for looking throughout the country for spare parts for the conversion project, remembered seeing an abandoned, derelict Lanc, formerly known as Lady Orchid, out in the farmlands of Alberta. She had been in rough shape, too rough for the conversion project, but perhaps, just perhaps, the center section would be sound. This Lancaster in question, KB 895, was also a Mark 10, also built at the Victory Aircraft Factory in Malton, and left for war on January 1945. By March 1945, she was in England, eventually issued to RCAF number 434, the Blue Nose Squadron, and was assigned to Flight Officer Jenkins and his crew. They had previously flown 11 missions in a British-built Lanc. However, KB 895 was to be their permanent aircraft, and so they decided to personalize it. The squadron code letters painted on the side of the aircraft were WLO, so they named the Lancaster Wee Lady Orchid. However, they soon dropped the Wee and just painted Lady Orchid on the nose of the plane, along with an image of a suitably naked Lady Godiva riding a bomb and carrying 2 6-shooter pistols. She carried the pistols as a nod to the western heritage of Calgary, Alberta, Jenkins' hometown. KB 895 and her crew began operations and flew a total of 5 missions by the time the war ended, including trips to Hamburg, Leipzig, Kiel, and Schwandorf. On the way to Kiel, she performed 2 corkscrew maneuvers to evade night fighter attack. When the war ended, she served as part of Operation Exodus, helping to bring Allied POWs back home. Then she was in training for the possible deployment to the Pacific as part of Tiger Force. Jenkins, his crew, and Lady Orchid were then ordered back west to Canada on their way to the Pacific. It wasn't an easy flight back across the Atlantic. Due to poor weather and 2 engine failures, it took 10 days to get back to Dartmouth, Nova Scotia on June 17, 1945. In September, the surrender of the Japanese ended the need for a Tiger Force, and so Jenkins and his crew were demobilized, and Lady Orchid was flown to Pierce, Alberta, and placed in storage. And that would seem to be the end of the story. Amazingly, 2 years later, in 1947, Jenkins found out that his old Lanc was up for sale as war surplus, and he made inquiries about buying it. His plan was to remove some of the instruments and seats and send them to his old crewmates as souvenirs. The Crown agreed to sell him Lady Orchid for $300, as long as he would promise to not try to obtain a certificate of airworthiness. He had the aircraft moved to a nearby farmer's property where the souvenir removal work could be done. Afterwards, the farmer had intended to turn the fuselage into a shed, but never did so. And so sadly, the remains of Lady Orchid lay rotting in the Alberta countryside, just waiting to be found by Bud Found. In 1953, a salvage crew was dispatched to the farmer's property, and soon enough, the huge center section was removed and loaded up on a large flat car for the trip to de Havilland Aircraft, where the repairs would be occurring. In July of 1953, the center section was transplanted in FM 213, and on August 26, 1953, she was test flown and returned to service, where she served as a maritime patrol aircraft with No. 405 Squadron, Greenwood, Nova Scotia, and No. 107 Rescue Unit, Torbay, Newfoundland, for 10 years. Finally retiring from the RCAF in late 1963, and was finally struck off charge on June 30th, 1964. Again, it seemed like the end of life of the storied Frankenstein aircraft. However, she was then purchased by the Royal Canadian Legion Branch 109 in Goderich, Ontario, and placed on pedestals outside the Sky Harbor Airport, where she would remain on display until 1977, when the Legion decided that they could no longer afford to maintain the memorial. Luckily enough, the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum was seeking a Lanc to restore at the time, and on July 1st, 1977, they officially acquired FM 213. It took 2 full years to dismantle and prepare her for transport to the CWH Museum at the Hamilton International Airport, and another 10 years of restoration work when FM 213 returned to the skies on September 11th, 1988. Although she contains the bones of 2 vintage Lancasters, one being a combat veteran, she wears the colors and designation of a 3rd Lanc, KB 726. VRA of number 419 Moose Squadron as a memorial to Pilot Officer Andrew Minarski, RCAF. The first time I published this episode, I didn't tell Minarski's story, but it's a hell of a tale of bravery, and so I'm telling it this time. Andrew Charles Minarski, known as Andy to his friends, was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada on October 14, 1916. The son of Polish immigrants and one of 6 children. He grew up in the city's North End and went through King Edward and Isaac Newton schools before finishing at St. John's Technical. In 1940, he signed up with the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, but didn't stay long. His heart was in the air. By September 1941, he was in the Royal Canadian Air Force, training at No. 3 Manning Depot in Edmonton. He had a difficult time picking up Morse code at the wireless school in Calgary, Alberta, so he was reassigned and soon trained as an air gunner at RCAF Station McDonald in Manitoba, graduating just before Christmas with his AG brevet. He was sent to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and promoted to temporary sergeant before shipping out overseas in early 1942. After a number of training assignments, he joined No. 419 Moose Squadron as a mid-upper gunner on Flying Officer Art de Brain's crew. Based at RAF Middleton St. George in England, the squadron started flying Vickers Wellingtons and then moved up to Halifaxes, and by 1944 they were flying Canadian-built Avro Lancasters. Mynarski's crew received Lancaster Mark 10 KB 726, call sign A for Able, in early June. On the 9th of June 12, 1944, just days after D-Day, Mynarski flew his 12th mission, a bombing raid over Cambrai, France. After being attacked by flak and coned by searchlights near the French coast, the Lancaster was attacked by a German Ju-88 night fighter. 2 engines were lost, fire took hold, and the order was given to bail out. As Mynarski headed for the rear escape hatch, he saw that tail gunner Pat Brophy was trapped in his turret, jammed and unable to rotate. Flames were everywhere. Without hesitation, Mynarski fought his way through the fire to try to free his friend. He grabbed a fire axe, pulled and pounded on the turret, but nothing worked. His flight suit and parachute caught fire. Eventually, Brophy, realizing Andy couldn't help without sacrificing himself, waved him away. Mynarski paused, crawled back to the hatch, saluted Brophy through the fire, and reportedly said, "Good night, sir," before jumping into the dark. Brophy was now alone and going steadily down, with the aircraft which was still loaded with bombs. He thought his time was near, so as a Catholic he repeated Hail Mary full of grace over and over again as fast as he could. He could even make out tall trees, even though it was dark, as the burning aircraft gave him enough light to see. Suddenly, he could feel the aircraft breaking up as the aircraft hit the trees. He felt as if he was still in his turret, but somehow he was flying in a different direction than the main part of the aircraft. All Brophy felt before he lost consciousness was the ground shaking twice, probably from some of the bombs they had on board. On the other hand, Mynarski, his parachute scorched and damaged, failed to slow his fall sufficiently. He crashed into a field, still on fire, but was found alive but horribly burned by French farmers who rushed him to a German field hospital. He died shortly afterwards. But tail gunner Brophy regained consciousness. He took stock of his body, and amazingly, everything seemed to be okay. He was lying in a small dry ditch. He then checked to see if he still had his revolver and his toothbrush, which were the only 2 personal things that he ever took with him when flying on an operation. Off in the distance he saw lights of a small village, and so he stumbled there, arriving just around daylight at around 6 a.m. He was scooped up by the French resistance and made it back to England in September. It was only then that he learned of Mynarski's death. The other members of the crew had all survived. It wasn't till after the war that the full story came out. Andy Mynarski was buried in the Mahadicourt communal cemetery not far from Amiens. Thanks to the persistence of his crew and commanding officers, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross in 1946 for valor of the highest order. He remains one of Canada's most revered airmen, remembered for choosing courage and friendship over his own survival. And so it is completely fitting that Vera fly, representing Mynarski's former Lancaster. To wrap up, I'd like to profile 2 Australian Lancs, A for Aussie and G for George. I've had requests to look at both of them from 2 separate people, and hey, I have to keep my listeners from Down Under happy. They are some of my most ardent and most long-listening fans. So here are their stories, which take very different paths. The Lancaster A for Aussie, serial ED664, was a heavy bomber flown by number 460 Squadron RAAF, one of the most active Australian units serving under RAF Bomber Command during World War II. Nicknamed to reflect its Australian identity, A for Aussie flew in dozens of operations, sometimes alongside fellow bomber G for George. It was the brutal winter of 1943, during a period when the air war over Europe was intensifying and bomber losses were staggering, and on the night of the 23rd to 24th of November, 1943, A for Aussie, carrying a mixed crew of 4 Australians and 6 British airmen, took to the skies as part of a massive raid on Berlin. Somewhere over the Netherlands, it was intercepted and shot down. The aircraft crashed in enemy territory, 3 of the crew were killed in action, and the remaining 4 were captured and became prisoners of war. The tragic service life of A for Aussie is sadly representative of many of the lost Lancasters in Bomber Command. Some lost before their crews had a chance to complete a single tour. In contrast stands G for George, serial W4783, another Lancaster of 460 Squadron. It's a story of rare survival and national pride. Built in 1942 by Metropolitan Vickers Limited in Manchester, UK, George flew its first mission on the 6th of December 1942. George flew 89 operational missions over occupied Europe, far more than most Lancasters ever managed, between 1942 and 1944. Crewed mainly by Australians, it flew into the teeth of the most heavily defended targets: Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen. Time and again, George returned to base, often peppered with flak holes and bearing scars of night combat, but always bringing its crews safely home. There were 0 casualties among the 250 aircrew who flew on George throughout the war, leading many to believe that this aircraft was lucky. In 1944, it was withdrawn from frontline service and sent back to Australia as a centerpiece for a national war bond tour, helping to raise funds and morale on the home front. Ultimately, George was declared surplus and transferred to the Australian War Memorial, where it remains preserved as a significant piece of aviation history. Usually, due to the historical nature of my subject matter, I don't have a whole lot of, breaking news to report, but in this case I do. At the moment of recording this, G for George was just recently moved to her new home, an expansion of the Australian War Memorial. She will be the centerpiece of the Australians in Bomber Command exhibit on the upper level of Anzac Hall. I do hope some of my Australian listeners go to visit, and hey, send me some pics. The stories of A for Aussie and G for George, though bound by squadron purpose and time, represent 2 vastly different wartime experiences. Aussie was one of the many aircraft and crews lost in the merciless air battles over Europe, a symbol of the ultimate cost of the strategic bombing campaign. George, against all odds, completed its tour and became a survivor, a symbol of endurance and hope. Together, they speak to the courage, sacrifice, and sheer uncertainty that defined the lives of the men who climbed aboard these aircraft night after night, never knowing if they'd ever return. So, to wrap up this episode with a little inspiring bow, I'll say that the next time you experience a setback in your life, think of the utter failure of the Avro Manchester, and how with a little imagination, this disaster of an aircraft became one of the most successful airplanes of all time. Until next time.